like 3 people, so I'll wait on the rest of you guys. Some have phones.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, so Deuteronomy chapter number 20, verse number 1. And this whole comment is, this whole chapter really is related to laws concerning warfare. I don't know if you've ever been in a point of your life where you're in a battle, and we're told that we don't always wrestle with flesh and blood. Like our fight's not always against one another or people, but sometimes there's a spiritual battle that is waving on. Sometimes we have situations in our lives that are there to bring us closer to God, that are there to help others get closer to God. Sometimes we go through situations and circumstances of warfare, and God has us in there selected as His army, as His piece, and He'll put us in a position of battle so that He could get glory, so that He can get honor, so that He could be proclaimed. So now let's look at this. Chapter 20, verse number 1. It says, when you go out to war against your enemies and see horses and chariots and an army larger than your own, you shall not be afraid of them, for the Lord your God is with you, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And when you draw near to the battle, the priest shall come forward and speak to the people, and shall say to them, Hear, O Israel, today you are drawn near for battle against your enemies. Let not your heart faint. Do not fear or panic or be in dread for them. For the Lord your God is He who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies, to give you victory. I don't know about you, but I need to hear today that we have a God that gives victories over different seasons and different wars and different circumstances that I find myself in. You know, sometimes I need to know how great and how big God is when I'm in this small room and there's a whole bunch of darkness around me. When the enemy seems so large and I seem so small. When they look like giants and I look like grasshoppers. I need to know that God is with me and that He is the one that gives victory. I need to turn away from looking by sight and looking at my circumstances and saying, man, they're horrible. Man, they're ugly. Man, they're disgusting. Man, there's no way to get out of this. Man, they're too big. There's no way that we'll conquer this land. There's no way that I'll get through this circumstances, this season, or anything else. It's just too large for me. Always when our circumstances, when we're looking by sight in them, they're always going to be so much greater. We need to learn to move ourselves from a reference point of our circumstances to a reference point of God. We need to be able to look at a reference points of hurt and failures and mistakes to a reference points of the cross. We need to be able to look at, man, I'm hurt and I'm in pain and I'm sick, to God is a healer and He's a provider and He cares for me and He'll give victory. I don't know what victory you need today, but I'm here to tell you that God is the one that gives us victory. Yet that's not exactly what happened in 1 Samuel chapter 17. And I pray as we turn to 1 Samuel 17 that we'll hear this chapter in a very fresh way. I think very often we can come to Scripture and it becomes very familiar. Well, like I remember hearing this when I was a child. There's nothing more that I can learn to this message. But Lord, please touch our hearts. Bring this word afresh. I don't want to hear it like I did 10 years ago. I don't want to hear it like I heard it 2 seconds ago. I want you to do something fresh, a rhema word today with this message. Anoint our ears, and again, anoint my voice to preach that, Lord. So, verse number 3, 1 Samuel 17, verse 3. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, And Israel stood on the mountain of the other side with the valley between them. We have two armies. We have two mountains. And we have a valley in between. Two mountains, two armies, and a valley in between. A lot of times we're on mountaintops. And everything is raining marshmallows, right? Everything's good on that mountaintop. There's nothing to worry on that mountaintop until you start looking down into the valley. I remember as we were driving here, the kids were listening in the back of the minivan to Lion King, and there's this part of this movie where Mufasa takes out his son, and he says, "Look into all the land. This is going to be yours. But you see that area where it's dark, where the shadows are there? Don't go into there." A lot of times, I wish life was like that, where we could look out on the mountaintop and say, look at all the plentiful. Look at all where the abundance is. Just fellowship in that your whole life. But don't spend any time in the shadows. Don't spend any time in the darkness. I wish life was that simple. But oftentimes you have two mountaintops and two armies and a valley in between. And the thing is when your enemy's also on a mountaintop and there's a valley in between, that voice echoes even louder. The voice of the enemy echoes and it communicates to you and it's being projected. Do we listen? Let's look at what happened. So in here we have Goliath, this huge enemy. A champion. A champion. 9 feet. 9 inches. Huge. With this amazing bronze helmet. With this amazing coat. This amazing coat that covered him. With 5,000 shekels of bronze. His legs were full with armor. He had this spear like a weaver's beam. The spearhead weighed 600 shekels of iron. This guy was filled from head to toe. Not only was he nasty looking, but his armor was like, wow. And he's there and he's projecting from this mountaintop. And life is good. But the projections keep getting louder and louder and louder. And eventually he calls out to them in verse number 10. And he says, out of 5 ranks of Israel this day, give me a man that we may fight together. Look what happens. When Saul and all Israel heard these words that the Philistines said, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. They're looking by sight. They're hearing these projections. And they're afraid. 16. For 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand. Morning and evening, the projections of negative report over and over and over. 40 days, 40 nights, over and over and over. Goliath taunted them every single morning, every single evening. You guys don't want a piece of me. Like I see Royal Rumble, I see Andre the Giant coming in. And he's saying, I want anyone to come up, whoever thinks that they're bigger, whoever thinks that they're better. And me at 5'10", I'm like, there's no way in my own strength I'm going to be able to conquer this giant. Look at him. Look in the armor. Look how tall he is. There's no way. They were afraid. They were greatly dismayed. Now look at verse number 19 after these 40 days and these 40 nights. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley. What? We're just on the mountaintop. But these projections get louder and louder, and I'm looking at it, that I'm fellowshipping with it, and instead of being on the mountaintop, now I find myself in the valley. I was on the mountaintop, but I was fellowshipping with God up here. But my eyes looked down. They heard the projections. And now I find myself in the valley fighting with the Philistines. I'm in the valley. Verse 23. And he talked with them. Behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. And David heard him. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him, and they were much afraid. So now they're in the valley, and Goliath's even closer. And he speaks again the same words. And they're afraid, and they begin to flee. They begin to run. They're terrified. They can't face this huge obstacle. But look at this. It says that they were there, all the men of Israel, and they saw the men. But David was also in the midst. David was in the midst, and he heard him. David was in the midst when he heard the same words that they heard. What was different between David and Israel? What was different than David and Saul? Verse number 26. And David said to the men who stood by him, What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach of Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that should defy the armies of the living God? Do you like, he doesn't even recognize this guy. He hears the projections and he realizes that this is coming from another realm. This is not coming from God. He's able to discern, and he says, this does not look right. This does not sound right. This is coming from another world system. This is coming from another vantage point. This is coming from another spirit. This is another gospel, another Jesus. I'm not going to take this. I'm not going to fellowship with this. I'm not going to let these promises, these fears and everything have a deposit and a root inside of me. Instead, I'm going to immediately confess that who is this that's bringing a false report that does not line up with God? Who is he to defy a living God? So, how does David hear the same words as all the men of Israel, yet he responds differently? They looked at the enemy while he looked at God. They focused on the problem when he focused on the provider. They responded by fear. He responded by faith. They made excuses. He'll provide examples of how God has delivered them in the past. So they looked at the enemy. He looked at his God. They focused on their problem. He focused on his provider. They responded by fear. He responded by faith. They made excuses. He provided examples to God's faithfulness. Look at this. So now in verse number 33. You are not able to go against the Philistines to fight with him, for you are a youth. And he has been a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. When a lion came or a bear came or anyone came, I would destroy that. God gave me provision. He's always been there for me. He always allowed me to have victory. The same God that did it then will do it now. He's going to give me victory. He's going to make me more than an overcomer. God will be with me. So Saul says to him in verse 37 at the latter part, he says, go and the Lord be with you. That's the only promise I need, is that if I go, God will be with me. And if God be with me, who can be against me? So he goes with that promise. And instead of putting on armor, which he tried, and he's like, this doesn't fit. He takes off that armor. Now remember, Goliath, this huge giant, almost 10 feet tall, stands up with all this armor. All this armor, it's again like that Pastor Shalom message of Job, where this, what was the word? Leviathan is there, and he's imperishable. Like his skin is so thick, it's impenetrable. Like I cannot be able to attack him and win on my own strength. But thank God we don't fight against flesh and blood on our own strength. When I am weak, then Christ is strong. I fight as an overcomer, knowing that this fight has been fixed. And if it's been fixed, that means that it's a finished work and Christ has already won. And I walk into this victory knowing that I'm already going to win it. In your situation, in your darkness, in your pain, know that you're already an overcomer. You don't got to wait till the battle to become an overcomer. Go into the battle knowing that it's already won, that God promised no matter how big, no matter how large this army looks, that he will give you victory. You got to remember who the promise giver is and what the promise was. So David says in verse 45, you come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands. The battle is the Lord's. He will give me you into my hands. We need to go into warfare knowing that God, our God, has already given us victory. We need to be able to look at the enemy, not in our own strength, not in our own might, but we're able to look at him eye to eye. Say, I don't care how big you are. I don't care how scary you look. I don't care what you're doing in my life. I don't care if there's sickness. I don't care if there's pain. I don't care what it looks by sight. But the victory will be God's. I don't care the pain. I don't care the hurt. God will give me victory over this. He will deliver you into our hands because the victory is the Lord's. And the most amazingest thing is we live on this side of the cross. We already know that the victory's been won. We already know that he died on our behalf. We already know that our greatest enemy was sin, and yet Christ tackled that head on, and he lived a perfect life. And he looked at the enemy of sin that took out every single man that has ever lived. And he went to every single temptation, being tempted every way that we could, going through every war that we could, and he was an overcomer. And then he, not only that, but he went to the cross. And he who knew no sin became sin in my place. That's not it. On the third day, he rose again because he was victorious. Our God is a God that lives, a God that finished the war, and we live in victory today. Live on this side of the finished work. Don't focus on the darkness. Don't focus on the hurt. Don't focus on the pain. Enlarge God. Enlarge God. Focus on his promises, because it doesn't matter how big the enemy is. Amen. Amen.